With the recent box office flop of Shazam and a few lackluster Disney Plus outings, people are sounding the alarm that the comic book movie bubble is finally bursting.
Lord have mercy, I'm about to bust.
Claiming that Shazam 2 is just the canary in the coal mine for the whole situation, and that Marvel and DC are both in a perpetual downward spiral in terms of public popularity. But are comic book movies really on the verge of extinction? Or is the waning popularity of comic book movies just a natural part of the life cycle of franchise filmmaking? The answer may surprise you.
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next products.
That doesn't work either!
Comics have always had this weird ebb and flow when it came to their cultural impact and the public's interest in them. The 90s comic crash comes to mind as one of the best known examples of comics getting less popular amongst casual consumers. Computer, explain the 90s comic crash for the folks at home.
Sure, but I want to spice it up a bit and try something new with my voice.
The 90s comic crash was defined by a sharp drop in sales and the closure of many comic book retailers and publishers.
Computer, I don't think using AI voices is a good idea. Twitter gets really weird about that stuff, and I don't want to get canceled.
Let me have my moment.
There were several factors that contributed to the comic crash.
Overproduction and over-speculation of the books.
Publishers were printing too many comics and flooding the market with variant covers and special editions,
Which led to decrease in demand. X-Force type dog shit.
And shiny covers,
Another factor was the rise of alternative forms of entertainment.
Video games and the internet.
which drew attention and money away from comics.
The focus on flashy art over compelling storytelling.
The crash was also influenced by a number of internal problems within the industry, including a lack of distribution, poor management, and disputes between publishers and creators.
So, to sum it up, overproduction,
Changing cultural tastes and internal issues within the industry.
sound familiar?
The downturn in sales nearly bankrupted Marvel Comics, forcing them to sell the film and TV rights to some of their most popular characters at a heavily discounted rate. An unfortunate move that we still feel the ramifications of in the modern age. But if you want to hear more about the 90s comic crash and who's to blame for it, then check out my Marvel Legends video here. But what I'm trying to say is that comic books becoming less popular didn't kill comic books. If anything, it's that stagnation that forced them to adapt and try new things, resulting in the comics of the early 2000s being some of the most fresh and innovative takes that we've seen since. Books like Ultimate Spider-Man, Avengers Disassembled, The Ultimates, Civil War, stories that shaped the film adaptations and the entire MCU even. Comics that went on to define what we think of when we think of comic books and comic book storytelling. So did the 90s comic crash kill comics? No it didn't. If anything, it only made them stronger. So we know why comics lost popularity in the 90s, but can we figure out why they're becoming less popular today? The early days of cinema were defined by universal horror movies. Movies like Frankenstein spun off Bride of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, an entire genre of monster movies and monster crossover movies. There was even this weird project in the 60s that combined two of the most popular genres and characters from the era, combining horror movies and Western movies with Billy the Kid versus Dracula. And now in the modern age, we get stuff like Batman vs. Superman, Freddy vs. Jason, and King Kong vs. Godzilla. It's kind of funny to think that as much as movies have changed in the past 70 years, they also really haven't changed at all. But even though the Universal monster movies got less and less popular, they still kind of maintained cultural relevance. And it seems like even to this day, every 5 or 10 years, we get a new take on Frankenstein or Dracula, all on account of how their popularity helped embed them in our collective pop culture consciousness. Like I said before, comics have always been a reflection of pop culture and whatever's popular at the time. And comics have this weird tendency to immortalize pop culture icons and keep them alive even years after they've fallen out of vogue with the mainstream. Which makes it kind of funny that different iterations of Dracula and Frankenstein have both become mainstay staples of the DC and Marvel universes. I mean, after all, horror movie monsters are just supervillains in worlds that don't have superheroes, you know? But like I mentioned earlier, Kung Fu movies became more popular in the 70s, so we got Shang-Chi and Iron Fist. And even though Kung Fu movies got less popular over time, it doesn't mean those characters disappeared. And in the 90s, when skateboarding and grunge were the it thing, Marvel gave us Adam fucking X, a character that's still showing up and being acknowledged in modern X-Men books. And then in the 2010s, people became a little bit more socially conscious, which meant that the heroes and prominent figures that were introduced in that era matched that same energy. Now, if you're in the comments section screaming, "Go woke, go broke," just hear me out. One of the things I enjoyed most about CW's Supergirl was how it felt like a remix of classic Superman stories.
Hey,
Hey, I've seen this one.
It was all of the same old stories I was familiar with, but they were told from the perspective of a modern millennial mid-20-something chick, instead of a Boy Scout farm kid. And when I read Ms. Marvel, I fell in love with the book and the characters in all the same ways I fell in love with Ultimate Spider-Man as a kid. All the beats of a high school-age Spider-Man story are present in Ms. Marvel. I even found Ms. Marvel relatable in ways that Peter Parker never had been to me. I grew up in a very conservative Christian household, where I wasn't even allowed to read Harry Potter books. So seeing Kamala grow up in a conservative Muslim household felt really relatable in ways that Peter Parker's story never really had been to me. Even though my life experiences and Kamala's were drastically different, there was still a lot that we had in common. And that's just one reason I fell in love with the original run of Ms. Marvel. Comics aren't going woke. They're just reflecting our changing cultural values like they always have. And there have always been growing pains when comics try something new. After the civil rights movement, it felt really important to create new diverse characters who represented the new ideals that the culture felt it was important to reflect. But the problem was that you had a bunch of white guys whose primary experience with black people was through blaxploitation cinema, which gave these new characters some iffy and distasteful dramatic flair. The early Luke Cage comics had a lot of that kind of thing, but when you fast forward 50 years into the future, the character starred in one of the best TV adaptations that Marvel's ever put to screen.
I ain't laying back no more.
You wanna shoot me?
Do it. Pull the trigger, nigga. I ain't got all night. Fine. I'll do it for you.
And in the same way that Luke Cage had some rough edges in the beginning, I feel like the same can be said of characters like Dreamer and Supergirl. If you don't know, Dreamer is DC's first trans superhero. I talked about this more in my CWDC video a few years ago, but the characterization of Dreamer almost felt like tokenization at times. But when you see the character pop up in the latest season of Flash, or when she shows up in modern comic books, a lot of those rough edges have been ironed out. But at the same time, you have all these people decrying that going woke is the reason that comic books are going downhill. But is that really true at all? At one point, it was extremely popular to claim that the Jane Foster era of Thor resulted in the biggest downturn in sales for the character in decades. And that it was that downturn in sales that resulted in the decision to bring Thor back sooner. But YouTuber Comic Drake did a deep dive and disproved those rumors pretty easily. In fact, Lady Thor was so popular and outsold the mainline Thor books so much that they decided to give her a whole new superhero mantle in her own book even after the run ended. But throwing numbers at you to prove why grifters like the Quartering and Nerdrotic are wrong is just boring content. Instead, I want to talk about two contrasting comic book panels and what they mean to me personally.
Oh boy. Today's lesson is cause and effect. I get a time machine, I get to be a Time Lord.
In the first panel, Clark is about to leave Earth to go free an enslaved alien planet. His powers have been waning, and he doesn't know if he's going to make it back alive or not. So he leaves the job of protecting Earth and the mantle of Superman to his son John. But it's the question that John asks of his father that really strikes me as significant. Why don't you do more? It's a line that Grant Morrison expands on in Superman and the Authority. Superman assembles a team of anti-heroes, former bad guys, and newcomers to take with him to Warworld. When Superman's faced with criticism from one of his biggest objectors, Superman takes that criticism to heart, and he explains why his son's words have inspired him and changed him. And the way that Superman talks about how his feelings have changed makes me think about how the times in general have changed, especially when you contrast it with this panel of Superman and Reagan. Reagan is being subtly manipulated by Darkseid and asks the superheroes to step down temporarily. Superman obeys without objection because he has full faith in Reagan. Contrast that with Marvel's Civil War, where the entire point of the story in the comics and the movie is that Tony was wrong and Cap was right, that bending the knee and submitting to authority is never the answer. Not to mention I could write an entire video essay on why the economic and social consequences of Ronald Reagan's presidency have been disastrous for the entire American race.
Everyone, I have a brief announcement to make. Jesus was black, Ronald Reagan was the devil, and the government is lying about 9/11. Thank you for your time, and good night.
But look at these two panels side by side, because they reflect our changing cultural values. Superman has changed because we as a collective society have changed, and Superman is supposed to be a reflection of the best in us, a character that we can hope and aspire to be like. Grant Morrison further contextualizes this by showing us Superman's meeting with JFK, as well as having Superman mourn the future that could have been with JFK, mourning the hope that they had all taken for granted and lost in the modern years, a hope for the future that seems to have died with JFK. Boomers getting over themselves and developing isn't just a common trope in comics, it's the entire catalyst to the plot of Encanto. The idea that older people need to change and grow and learn instead of being stagnant is a persistent trope in modern media. So is it really a surprise to see that trope reiterated in the world of comic books? John is a reflection of our cultural aspirations. Just like Miles represents the idea that anyone could be Spider-Man, John represents the idea that anyone can be Superman, even a socially awkward gay kid. As recently as 10 years ago, any character with that descriptor wouldn't have been allowed to be the kind of character that John gets to be, and that's what makes him so special to the people who've fallen in love with this iteration of the character. He's literally a social justice warrior, and I don't mean that in a bad way. And sure, I mean some parts of the run have been a little bit rough around the edges, and maybe some of the lines in the comic feel like they were written in a way to purposefully satisfy ESG scores, but like I said earlier about Luke Cage, these comics have always been rough around the edges when they try something new. But given enough time, as new writers and newer ideas get introduced and added to the character, he can really evolve into something special, and for a lot of people, especially teens and newcomers, he already has. 2 panels, 20, 30, 40 years apart, but I gotta admit, there's a point of contention here that my cognitive dissonance kinda struggles with. It's this line from All-Star Superman: "What right do I have to enforce my ideals on anyone?" And that's something that the most recent John Kent story is actually addressed. John visits the world of the Injustice video games, a world where his premature death caused that world's Superman to become a tyrant. It's here that we see "why don't you do more" stretched to its logical extreme. John finds that this is a world where Superman isn't respected, he's feared. The logical extreme of what happens when you force your beliefs on others. So how do you split the difference between taking a stand and forcing your beliefs on others? Well, honestly, I think they're two separate things. I think that taking a stand is different than forcing people to believe what you believe and think what you want to think. Trying to tell people how to think is the kind of vibe that I get when I see all the hit pieces and articles and videos about comics going woke and why the new gay Superman is harmful to America's youth. The idea is that we should be accepting and we should stand up for what's right, regardless of consequence. The idea is that gay people and trans people are valid and deserve to be seen. The idea is that these characters just existing dignifies people who haven't been seen or dignified in the past. And that's a good thing. No one is forcing anyone to read comics with gay or trans characters. No one's being forced into anything. You don't have to read the book if you don't like it. But even recently, Superman has always been a character that's used to take a stand, even prior to John Kent's existence. Take this scene from the New 52 run of Superman. Superman's lost his powers, and in the face of a corrupt police force who are attacking peaceful protesters, Superman risks his own freedom and reputation in order to keep those protesters safe from harm. Because taking a stand was the right thing to do here. That's what superheroes do.
Even in the darkest times, hope cuts through. Hope is the light that lifts us out of darkness.
I never quits no matter what Earth he's from, huh?
But Swim, if Superman wouldn't submit to government authority, then why did he turn himself in Man of Steel or that one episode of Justice League Unlimited? Because context is key. In both those circumstances, turning himself in was the right thing to do. In Justice League, a weapon that the League created and was responsible for was misused in a way that hurt innocent civilians. In Man of Steel, no one knew who Superman was yet, and he had to prove to the American people and the American government that they could trust him. I think that in both of those circumstances, turning himself in was the right thing to do. It wasn't willing submission like Superman and Reagan. He was doing what he had to do for the sake of the better good. But what about when the government asks you to stand down, or says you can't save someone defenseless from harm? To quote another great superhero, compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree. Look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
I told all your colleagues, those clown comics, to fix their hearts or die.
Standing up for what's right and not letting the government get in the way of that was at the core of another recent Superman story. Superman gave up his American citizenship, but it wasn't for the reason that right-wing media tried to portray it as. As an American citizen, America would be held responsible for anything that Superman does overseas. To use a real-world example, if Superman flew into the Ukraine, even in a non-combative way, and was just saving civilians instead of entering the fight, Uncle Sam would still be held responsible. It could lead to the US having to enter the war, or worst case scenario, lead to World War III. But with Superman revoking his citizenship, it no longer becomes an issue. But just like John becoming the first gay Superman, It was completely taken out of context and sensationalized by the media. They tried to portray it as Superman being anti-American, that way they could tie it to their own political narratives. And then they did it all over again when John Kent came out as bisexual, because of course they did. Weirdly enough, they tried to take it out of context, and they tried to portray it as if Clark Kent, the original Superman, was going to become a gay man after years of being straight. Like Clark was leaving Lois and the kids and shirking his familial responsibilities to go hang out at the bathhouse with Jimmy instead.
Get the fuck out of my bathhouse.
That was the narrative that right-wing outlets were more than happy to run with. For one, because that narrative would frustrate boomers more than the idea of Superman's son being gay. And then the other reason is that it ties into the network narrative that LGBT propaganda is being used to indoctrinate and groom the masses. I've got so many good bad quotes about this, so I'm just gonna play a few here.
The new Superman, the son of Clark Kent and Lois Lane, is concerned about the environment, does not shy away from politics, and will soon begin a romantic relationship with a male friend.
Bisexual comic book for kids? They're literally trying to destroy America.
This isn't saving anything. This isn't making anybody buy any books.
Gay Aquaman, a bisexual boy wonder, Robin, and a gender fluid Loki. Call me when they have a gender stable aisle with superheroes whose sexualities we know nothing about.
I say they're bandwagoning. You know, a Robin of Batman and Robin, as you mentioned, just came out as bi or gay recently. And honestly, who's really shocked about that one?
I want to punch my screen. I want to punch this guy in the face. I want to punch this guy in his fucking dumb face.
Artists behind the character have said they need police protection because of the backlash they have received.
Anyway, leave our comic book heroes alone. We don't want to hear any more about what they do when they're not apprehended.
Is trying to make Superman gay, and he is not. It's his son, schmuck. Just rename the new version Superman, get it? So we can all know the difference and avoid seeing it.
LAPD officers were dispatched to the homes of the illustrators and production staffers after the studio received numerous threats from angry fans of the comic book.
Why are they sexualizing superheroes? You know, I was a Batman and a Superman, Spider-Man kid. I loved those heroes. We just wanted them to get the bad guys, not a venereal disease.
Soon start vigorously ass-pounding Jay with his super penis.
So I don't think it's bold or brave or some crazy new direction. If they had done this 20 years ago, perhaps that would have been bold and brave.
Up and out of the closet. Oh.
But honestly, I don't exactly know why comics are becoming less popular. I mean, I have a few theories, but one thing I do know is this. The landscape of superhero comics will always hold a mirror to the most popular ideas expressed and felt at the time that they're being written. Our culture, pop culture, and comic culture are intertwined with each other. And pop culture is always changing. So comic books are always changing. And comic books never die.
Superman 4 was such a disaster, it has put an end to this flash-in-the-pan superhero genre. Well, we had a good run there for a moment, but after this, no one's taking superhero films seriously ever again. After a disappointing Daredevil movie and the chore that was this, there simply aren't enough characters for the superhero genre to sustain itself. Spider-Man 3 had all the potential in the world, but ended up being a massive disappointment. We have already seen the peak of the superhero genre. If they can't get Spider-Man right, what are we even doing? No way this character has another billion-dollar film in his future. Shazam 2 was such a box office bomb, superhero fatigue is real, marking the end of the superhero genre. This time we mean it. Matter Eater Lad 7 didn't do well as expected. Some say it's because of the acid storms in the Northeast, but I think this is it. Superhero films are finally done and over with.
So that TikTok and a few other posts on Twitter about the cancellations and shakeups with the MCU and DC movies are what inspired this video. And it was also my attempt to address some of the common go woke, go broke shit-slinging criticisms that get thrown around a lot. There are a lot of answers to the question of why is comic media getting less popular? Oversaturation and audience fatigue, new forms of entertainment and media overshadowing older media in terms of relevance, attempts to satisfy ESG scores making the script seem kind of awkward, cultural division amongst the populace over contentious issues that are presented inside of the comic books, or, you know, it could just be that comics are just ebbing and waning in terms of popularity, you know, like they always have for the past 100 fucking years. Yeah, my money's on that one. But there are a lot of valid criticisms to be found in everything that I mentioned before. From the fact that audiences want to see more stuff like Batman and Spider-Man instead of stuff like Shazam 2 and Ant-Man 3 or The Flash, or even the idea that attempts to satisfy ESG score quotas have resulted in awkward and even sometimes offensive but well-intentioned stereotypes that kind of put off everyone from reading the books where they're introduced in. But at the end of the day, I'm really not worried about comics or any of these issues.
I'm not worried about it! I'm not worried about any of this!
These are the kinds of things that'll sort themselves out in the long term, just like they did in the 90s and just like they did decades and decades beforehand. Because like I said before, at the end of the day, comics never die. I'm going to do another video about why comic book video games suck soon, and I plan on getting back to the Batman series by the end of the year, but for now I'd like to thank my lovely supporters on Patreon, and if you want to see more videos you can check out those here. So with all that being said, I've been Swim Team Captain 7 of Super Swim Team 7, signing off.